totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Greg Prato is a returning guest. He's here to talk about his brand new book, Lanegan. Mark Lanegan is among the greatest voices of grunge rock's golden era. His unmistakable and instantly recognizable vocals can be heard on classic recordings on songs by Screaming Trees. He can also be heard on several songs by the band Queens of the Stone Age. He was a poet and an author of several popular books. Sadly, he endured addiction, hard living, and health difficulties before passing away in 2022 at the age of 57. Greg pays tribute to one of rock's great poets and lyricists in this book. It features over 20 all-new interviews with Lanegan's fellow collaborators, friends, and admirers. He'll share some of those stories from the book in this interview, plus which Nirvana song did Mark Lanegan co-write lyrics for but wasn't credited. Find out the song and why he wasn't credited in this episode. I put together a playlist of Mark Lanegan's music, many of the songs handpicked by Greg himself. You can find the link to that playlist in the show notes page. Now, here is Greg Prato. Hey, Greg, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having me back on.
Mark Lanegan, he's often overlooked when you hear people talk about the grunge rock era of the early 90s. Was that the inspiration for you to write this book?
Definitely part of it. I will be as bold to say, and I'm speaking from experience, if you are not familiar with Mark Lanegan, if you listen to the best Screaming Trees material, the best Queens of the Stone Age material, and the best solo Mark Lanegan material, you will find out that he is every bit as good as your Kurt Cobains and your Chris Cornells. I'm telling you.
Why do you think he is overlooked?
I think drugs really had a lot to do with it. I think if he did not have a drug problem, the Screaming Trees would have been a lot more popular. Their 1992 album called Sweet Oblivion spawned the hit single and hit video Nearly Lost You, which was also on the single soundtrack. And they did not issue and that album did like pretty good. It didn't go gold, but it like almost went gold. And they opened up a large portion of the Dirt US tour with opening up for Alice in Chains. So they were definitely in the public's eye and they were primed for the next step. And at that point was when Mark Lanegan really developed a bad heroin addiction, and the Screaming Trees tried to record a follow-up album in a timely manner, which would have come out around 94, 95, I think, but it got shelved because he was in such bad shape. And they did not issue a follow-up album, a proper follow-up album, until 1996. And by that point, Kurt Cobain had died and the direction of music had changed. And by that point, you had Green Day and The Offspring, and you had like Limp Bizkit coming up and Korn and all that stuff. So grunge wasn't at the forefront as it probably would have still been in 94.
I discovered them through Nearly Lost You. I had the single soundtrack. That's the first time I heard.
Yeah, I did too. And honestly, it wasn't until really Mark was a member of Queens of the Stone Age, because I'm a huge fan of Queens of the Stone Age, and I was lucky to see him several times play with Queens of the Stone Age. But it wasn't until that time that I really started going back and inspecting his solo material. And his solo material is absolutely outstanding. Such albums as Whiskey for the Holy Ghost has become one of my favorite albums. Another album called Bubblegum is absolutely a underrated classic. A great album called The Winding Sheet is also a great one. So if you're not familiar with Mark Lanegan, definitely check out those albums. And the best Screaming Trees albums, I'd say, are Uncle Anesthesia, which was co-produced by Chris Cornell. We talked already about Sweet Oblivion, which was fantastic. And also the last Screaming Trees album that was issued during their time as a band, which was called Dust. Those are the best ones.
What's interesting, they go back into the mid-'80s. They go that far back. Chapter 1 gets into Mark's early days, and you get some great comments from Screaming Trees guitarist Gary Lee Conner, who knew Mark as far back as elementary school.
Yes.
Who was Mark Lanegan? Where's he from? How does Screaming Trees form?
They're from a town called Ellensburg, Washington. And you think of Washington, you automatically think of Seattle, and you think of, oh, it's rainy and it's never really, it's like kind of not cold, but not too hot. But what Gary explains is that Ellensburg actually is like almost like part of like a desert. So it's not what you associate Seattle being like, the type of weather. They were acquaintances, I think, during school, but not really friends. And it was just by chance, the Connors, it was Gary Lee Conner was the guitarist, and Van Conner, his brother, who sadly just passed away like about a month ago, was the bassist. And their parents owned a video store, like a video cassette rental store. And they just so happened to, the family hired Mark as just a guy to work there. And I guess he got wind of that Gary was writing songs. He had an early 4-track recorder, and he was recording some very interesting songs that were more in like a psychedelic rock type of sound. It wasn't really grunge, and it wasn't punk, it wasn't heavy metal. And I guess Mark heard that, and somehow one thing led to another, and they tried him out as a singer, and he had a decent voice at the time, but then quickly he became very, very good. And then he became ultimately one of the best rock singers ever, I think, personally.
Didn't they use the back room at the video store to jam and rehearse?
Yeah, because originally they were recording and writing in Gary's bedroom, and then they luckily had a huge back room at the actual video rental store, and the parents let them set up all their stuff there, and Gary was able to bring also his 4-track there, and they had a proper space to rehearse and work on material. What
type of parents did Mark have? Did he have a good childhood? Were there difficulties?
No, it turns
growing
out
up?
he didn't. He had a very troubled childhood. He never got along with his mother. And his father, I think he did get along with, but it was a divorced family. And I think he split time between both of them. And he talks about also in his book, I think he had a decent relationship with his, he had a sister, had a decent relationship with her, but didn't really get along with her husband or something like that. He talks about all this in his book, which is called Sing Backwards and Weep, which has gone on to become one of my favorite books. It's a very tough read, though, because it's very honest and unflinching. Mark talks about his horrible drug addictions and how, really honestly, he should have died much sooner than he did, just with the things he put himself through and the very dangerous situations he was in with just copying drugs and selling drugs and everything else. It's really just a miracle that he was able to live so long. I think he lived to 57 was how old he lived.
Almost a year ago exactly, he passed, right?
Yes. But it was in that book called Sing Backwards and Weep. If you want the whole backstory of his childhood, that's really the book to check out. With my book, primarily what I try to set out to do is just, I really wanted to pay tribute to him, mostly from a musical and also personal standpoint, not so much his childhood. I really wanted to just pick up with his music. That was really the main focus. And with this book, I did over 20 exclusive interviews, including, we talked about Gary Lee Conner, who's the longtime Screaming Trees guitarist, and he also wrote the majority of the Screaming Trees music and also songs, especially early on. Kim Thayil from Soundgarden, Nick Oliveri from Queens of the Stone Age, Chris Goss from another very underrated band that I love called Masters of Reality, who also produced a bunch of Mark's material. Charles R. Cross, who is the author of the best-selling Kurt Cobain biography called Heavier Than Heaven. Chad Channing, the drummer for Nirvana for Bleach, and a bunch of other people. I interviewed somebody named Megan Jasper, who people may not know, but she's currently the CEO of Sub Pop Records, and she was back in the early 90s, maybe even back to the late 80s. She was the receptionist at Sub Pop. So she goes way back with Mark, and she has fantastic stories. In fact, she probably told some of the best stories of the whole book, just her experiences with Mark and how both the good, the bad, and the ugly with Mark, like some really horrible low points and just really bad things he did in his life, but then also some great things and how he was so, good to his friends and everything. So there was definitely two sides to Mark Lanegan.
Yeah, you do devote a chapter to the personality.
Right.
He was super tight with Kurt Cobain back in the day. When does Nirvana enter Mark's radar? He saw
not only was he tight with Kurt Cobain, he was probably even tighter with Lane Staley, it turns out. Okay. We talk a little bit about that. But yeah, he and Kurt first crossed paths in the late 80s. Mark was an acquaintance of the Sub Pop guys, but funny enough, the Screaming Trees never recorded a full-length album for Sub Pop. They just did an EP. But he was talking to the guys from Sub Pop, and they convinced Mark to come down to see a show, a local show. And I forget who the headliner was, but Nirvana was way down on the bill. And this was probably like 88-ish, before they put out Bleach. Mark watched the show, and the guys from Sub Pop, which would have been Bruce Pavitt and also Jonathan Ponman, approached him and said, Mark, what do you think of the headliner? Weren't they so great? And Mark was like, forget about the headliner. The band that you should really be devoting all your attention to is the middle band, Nirvana. So he was a early champion of Nirvana, and also recognized Kurt Cobain's talent. And from that, they became friends. And on the album, The Winding Sheet, there's the rendition of the song "Where'd You Sleep Last Night," which then Nirvana covers for their live in Unplugged Live in New York album.
Right. He also helped Soundgarden.
Who Mark you're talking about?
Yeah, wasn't that the band too that he?
Actually, it wasn't so much Mark Lanegan. It was Mark Pickrell, who was the drummer of Screaming Trees. What happened was the Screaming Trees were signed to SST Records in the late 80s. And Mark Pickrell was a fan of Soundgarden, also a friend of Soundgarden. And he personally delivered a demo tape of Soundgarden to Greg Ginn, who is the former Black Flag guitarist and also the then head of the SST label. And he turned them on to Soundgarden, then Soundgarden then goes on to record Ultra Mega OK for SST.
Okay, interesting though. All those bands that just
it's all
small
intertwined.
world,
It's
man.
all yeah.
Screaming Trees' first album came out way back in 1986. Clairvoyance, right? That's the name of the first one.
Yes.
Is that okay? They released 4 albums in the 80s, and you did talk to Matt Pinfield, the DJ, the TV personality, music exec too. He talks about that early sound the band had, and he said he heard more of a UK vibe. He compared it to Joy Division and The Cure. Do you hear that as well? How different was their sound in the 80s as opposed to the 90s?
You know, what's funny is I hear more of the Joy Division type thing in Mark's later solo albums. There's a solo album he put out in 2012 called Blues Funeral, which is absolutely fantastic. It's like it's a mix of Joy Division and also the early Iggy Pop solo albums, The Idiot and also Lust for Life. It has a electronic punk dance type thing, but it's very dark and it's just fantastic. One of my favorite Mark Lanegan songs is on that album. The title of the song is the Gravediggers song. That's one of my favorite Mark Lanegan songs, and that really is a hybrid of Joy Division and The Idiot by Iggy Pop.
Yeah, you got me interested now. I got to listen to his solo stuff. I was giving the Screaming Trees catalog a big listen over the weekend, just getting caught up on it, because I admit I knew Nearly Lost You, and at least around here, maybe in Seattle, they got a ton of airplay on modern rock stations.
Yeah.
Around here in the U.S., we're both from the East Coast. Yeah. I don't remember hearing them on the radio a lot, not even on MTV. I didn't see them.
I only remember really Nearly Lost You being played by MTV and hearing that on the radio. That was the only song I heard. There was one song off the Dust album, All That I Know, I believe is the title of it. Like I know the lyrics, not so much the titles, but I'm pretty sure that's also the name of the song. I heard that once on the radio. I remember just one time hearing that. And then that was it.
Why is that? They had it. They were on a big label. Right?
They were on a big label. And not only were they on a big label, they were also in 1996, they were on Lollapalooza and they were being managed by Q Prime, which was the management of Metallica. I just think it has to come down to payola and has to come down to Metallica's management focusing more on Metallica and not so much on Screaming Trees. It's just in being in the right place at the right time. Again, the Screaming Trees, if they put out that album Dust in 1993, 94, 95, it probably would have done a lot better. And again, who knows if Kurt Cobain doesn't die, maybe the Screaming Trees tour with Nirvana, it's just all these what ifs kind of, but
it's crazy. The music
drugs
business
just really just got in the way of so many greats in the 90s. Of course, Shannon Hoon, we talked about a lot in the past. It screwed Screaming Trees. It screwed, of course, it screwed Kurt Cobain. And sadly, it would ultimately also screw Chris Cornell as well.
Yeah, I mean, but they had some songs like Dollar Bill was one that when I heard that, I was like, how was that not on the radio?
Dollar Bill, a song called Butterfly. There's a great song called Troubled Times. Winter Song is fantastic. The last song on the album called Julie Paradise is fantastic. They also had a song on the previous album, a song called Bed of Roses. That song should have been a huge hit, but just wasn't. And then even on that last album, the song called All I Know is great. Halo of Ashes is absolutely fantastic. It's a psychedelic Beatlesy type song, but it's not a ripoff. It was just... there's just, I don't know, just certain bands just never get the credit they deserve. But luckily for music nerds like us, we have this music to go back and we have so much. See, the thing that I'm so grateful for, Mark Lanegan is almost like the anti-Shannon Hoon, meaning that we have so little of Shannon Hoon and we have so much of Mark Lanegan. And luckily, he just seemed to get better and better and better. I'm not saying that Shannon Hoon didn't get better. I'm just saying that we didn't get enough music from Shannon Hoon that I wish we had.
See, this is the upside to Spotify and streaming services. This
Absolutely.
is where people can listen to it without making that commitment. Do I want to buy this? So
Absolutely.
you could just hit play, which is what I was doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And also in this book, there's even a chapter called Classics where I have everyone talking about their favorite Screaming Trees, Queens of the Stone Age, and also Mark Lanegan tracks. And that's also how you could probably learn and discover a lot of these great songs as well.
Well, Bed of Roses did do well, though. It was a alternative rock hit, number 23. It reached back in 91. So it did.
It
good.
was, but it should,
It
you know
good.
what it was too, which I don't understand is, and this again is a very obvious thing, but it's the record label just with their fingers up their ass and not doing their job is, that came out, I believe, in early 91, that album. Grunge hits in fall of 91. So at that point, that album's probably considered done. If you have a brain in your head, you realize, wait a second, we should maybe reissue that song and video again.
Let's
and
go back.
We should go back a little bit. Let's try to get a little more interest in this album. And they didn't. They just said, they probably just said, now just go back in the studio and work on your next album, which did turn out to be a fantastic album, but you could have, cashed in obviously on the whole Nevermind hype and craze and grunge and everything at that point in the fall of 91.
It was Epic Records too.
It was Epic Records. So there's
there
was absolutely no excuse for, they just, you could say that Epic Records has been very good they were great with breaking Pearl Jam, but they totally fumbled the ball and did an awful job with Screaming Trees.
Yeah. Now, at this time, Mark had been sober. According to the book, he had been sober for a while, since 85 or 86. But guitarist Gary Lee Conner said he fell off the wagon around this time. Their van flipped.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, he started drinking as a result.
Yeah, what it was, he had a really bad drinking problem in the 80s. It wasn't really drugs, it was really just drinking. It was so bad to the point that he went to a doctor for a checkup or something. The doctor says, if you don't stop drinking, you're going to be dead in the next year or two. So he just stopped drinking. Then, yeah, you just mentioned the whole flipping of the van or whatever. I believe he starts drinking at that point, and then it just quickly snowballs into heroin, and then he's into crack and cocaine and almost everything he can get his hand on, to the point that he's dealing drugs in the mid to late 90s. He's like homeless. It's just a horrible life he has by the late 90s.
Now, people may be wondering, like, did he get injured in the van accident, so he was trying to kill the pain? That wasn't it, right? Did it just mess with his head? Because he had a lot of anxiety.
Because he had a really bad accident in right around the time the Screaming Trees formed in 84, 85.
The pea field.
Yes,
exactly. He's working in a pea field.
He had both his legs crushed. They claim that they weren't broken, but they were so badly damaged that he was laid up in bed for months. So, I don't know how your legs could be that badly damaged and not broken if you're laid up in bed for that long. But yeah, that was something that I think in fact, what he talks about later when he had COVID, he also put out a great book called Devil in a Coma, which he talks about. He had a horrible bout with COVID, and he was talking about how COVID, it actually, for him, attacked areas in his body that he had previous trauma, including his knee, which was regarding, I think, that whole entire pea field incident thing where he screwed up both his legs. So yeah, he had a weird experience with COVID that really screwed him up. Yeah.
And it was also, he was a hypochondriac.
Yes. That was what Gary Lee Conner says.
It's unfortunate because he probably could have talked to somebody, gotten some help for him, maybe, but he was self-medicating. I think more so for that, maybe, than anything else.
Possibly. He talked about in his book, and we also talk in this book, Lanegan, which I just also want to say is available as a paperback, hardcover, Kindle, and also an audiobook narrated by me.
Just came out, on the 15th of this month?
It did, yeah, because what it was it was coming up on the 1 year marking of Mark Lanegan's death. I wanted to pay tribute to him. Also, which we haven't talked about, I conducted, which may have been either the last or one of the last interviews he ever did in his life. I interviewed him in mid-December 2021, and he passes away in February of 2022. I interviewed him for the Heavy Consequence site. And I also included the full interview in this book. But I listened back to the audio, and now that I'm more familiar with Mark's voice and everything, you could tell he was very kind of weak sounding. He definitely wasn't back up to 100% health-wise, but he sounded very hopeful, and he was really looking forward to the future. But just sadly, his widow has not gone public with what the exact cause was of his death. Some people think it was possibly the after effects of COVID. It could have been a drug relapse. No one could have been a heart attack. No one really knows for sure.
57. Now,
57, yeah.
being a pop star wasn't something he really wanted to, he didn't want that. He wasn't comfortable with that, right? So interviews were a little difficult for him, or how was he with all of that?
Yeah, what's funny is I go back on YouTube and I watch interviews, and like there are quite a few interviews where he's just giving like one word answers. He's not coming off like a dick or anything like that, but you could tell he's
No.
like very shy, and he's just not very. He wasn't like very open usually with interviews. But funny enough, when I spoke with him, he was very nice and friendly and laid back. I mean, I spoke with one guy with a guitarist named Jeff Fielder, who was a longtime guitarist in Mark's solo band, and he said, and I mentioned that to him. I said, he had this whole persona of maybe he was difficult to be interviewed, but for me he was nice. And he said, I think that was probably because after what he went through with COVID, he was probably just happy just to be alive, and he thought he was in the clear now and everything was back on track, so he was just happy just to talk about things and just get his mind off things.
That second chapter, you get into his multifaceted and just complex character.
Yes.
What other things do people have to say about the person Mark Lanegan?
Yeah, it depends. Well, it just really, if he was bad off with drugs, he would steal and rob you and wouldn't think twice of doing that. If he was clean and sober, some of his friends say that there's not a better friend that you could have had as far as looking after his friends, taking care of them, nurturing them. So, I mean, it's just like there's that famous phrase, that you can never trust a junkie. And that from some of these stories in this book, and also even in his own book too. Absolutely. It seems like that definitely is a very true statement.
Somebody was saying too, if you wronged him, he wouldn't forget.
Yeah, that too. He would also hold a grudge.
Yeah, hold a grudge.
Yeah.
When I listen to his music, I hear Jim Morrison in his voice. And sure enough, as I read through the book, photographer Charles Peterson mentions that he sounds like Jim Morrison. There's some other comparisons too. Charles R. Cross, he had a great quote. He said, Mark could have sang Mother Goose and it would have sounded like a murder ballad.
Right.
Darkness and Beauty. That's a quote in the book from Matt Pinfield. Who were Mark's influences as a vocalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim Morrison is the top, although he hated being compared to Jim Morrison. But Gary Lee Conner, the guitarist from Screaming Trees, confirms that Mark was, in fact, a Doors fan. So we kind of learned that. That's
nothing wrong with that.
Book. Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
But he also loved a band called the Gun Club, which was the singer in that band was called Jeffrey Lee Pierce, who Mark was very close with. And in fact, one of the best Mark Lanegan solo songs of all time has kind of an odd title. It's called Kimiko's Dream House. And that was co-written by Jeffrey Lee Pierce and also Mark. That's a fantastic song I recommend highly. It's a very like dreamy poppy type song.
Did somebody mention Tom Waits? No, I think it was
Tom Waits.
Was that what?
Also, yeah, Tom Waits. I think also also Ian Curtis from the band called Joy Division. I hear a little bit of also Iggy Pop, especially on the album called The Idiot. I hear definitely some Mark Lanegan in that. He was also a big Johnny Cash fan.
Johnny Cash, yeah.
Johnny
You can
Cash.
hear a little bit of that.
Yeah, so he also liked a Australian proto-punk band called Radio Birdman. I forget the name of the singer in that band, but he was a fan of that. Also another Australian band called Crime in the City Solution, which I wasn't that familiar with until I learned stuff with this book or was doing this book. And I listened to a little bit of that. But yeah, a lot of the singer-songwriter types, I think. He also loved, what's the name of the gentleman that wrote the song called Hallelujah? Leonard Cohen.
Oh, Leonard Cohen.
Cohen,
absolutely. Some Leonard Cohen in there too.
Yes, he also liked Leonard Cohen.
But the other thing was he was a great lyricist. He was a poet.
Fantastic lyricist. He, again, one of these things that I learned from this book, one of the best lyricists ever. Yeah, and like I know it probably sounds like I'm saying this because I just did a book, but I can honestly say from the bottom of my heart, comparing him to the greats like Kurt Cobain, Chris Cornell, he's absolutely every bit as good when it comes to singing, lyrics. I'm telling you, just dig deep with the material that's in this book, that chapter that people talk about his best songs and also his lyrics. He was a phenomenal lyricist. There's a song, he has a solo album called, the album is called Bubblegum. Some of the best lyrics you'll ever hear. A great song called When Your Number Isn't Up has some of the best lyrics. A song called Hit the City, fantastic lyrics. A song called Methamphetamine Blues, again, fantastic lyrics. And then possibly the best lyrics he ever did is in a song called Strange Religion, which later became famous because it was used in one of Anthony Bourdain's shows, I believe. It may have I don't know if it was recurringly used in one of in his shows, maybe the show called No or Reservations. I'm not sure, but
Okay.
yeah, but because also Mark was a guest on also one of those shows
He
for
was.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
he was, and yeah, so the lyrics to the song called Strange Religion are absolutely fantastic. But again, he has these albums that just from front to back are just absolutely flawless. Like that album Bubblegum, the album I mentioned earlier called Whiskey for the Holy Ghost, which Mark talked about in his previous book. Kurt Cobain was really a huge fan of that album right before his death. That was what he was listening to a lot in the winter and spring of early 1994.
What were some of the subjects that he tackled in his lyrics?
It's a lot about relationships, a lot about love lost, a lot about drugs, a lot about the what's so great about that song called When Your Number Isn't Up is you read the lyrics and you read a little bit more of his story, what he's singing about and what that song title is about is that all his friends are dead and he actually survived. And what the friends he's talking about, you figure out, are Kurt Cobain and also Lane Staley. Because that's a play on when your number is up, and when he's saying when your number isn't up, which meaning he's now alive. And a great line that he says is to janitor the emptiness, which means to take care of the emptiness that he's feeling. And just he has these profound, he really was a poet, really was a lyricist. I put him up there with your Bob Dylans, your Phil Lynotts, the great poets. I'm telling you. I predict in time Mark Lanegan will go down as one of, like, people will talk about the greats and Mark Lanegan will be in there.
Well, you never write a book unless you're totally behind the artist or the band. You're not.
Yeah, pretty much every book I've ever done, it's an artist that I wanted more attention, that I really think that band deserved the attention, whether it be the Meat Puppets or whether it be, of course, Shannon Hoon and also Blind Melon, Bad Brains. Yeah, the list goes on and on. But
did you get to see them live?
Who was Screaming Trees?
Yeah.
I never got to see Screaming Trees, but I saw Mark with Queens of the Stone Age about 3 or 4 times. And I was lucky enough to see the very short-lived lineup right when Songs for the Deaf came out. It was Nick Oliveri on bass, Josh Homme on guitar and vocals, Mark on vocals, Troy Van Leeuwen on keyboards and guitarist, and a gentleman by the name of Dave Grohl on drums.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He was with them for a little while.
I got to see them at the Bowery Ballroom, which is a small venue in New York City, and that to this day remains one of the best shows I've ever seen.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. There was a quote I pulled from the book regarding his lyrics. Jesse Hughes of the band Eagles of Death Metal had a great comment in the book. He said the lyrics have a melody in themselves. That's cool.
I'm telling you, he actually put out a book of all his lyrics. I believe it's called I Am the Wolf, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the books I have. I have a book that's Lou Reed and all his lyrics. Lou Reed is one of the great rock lyricists of all time. Compare that book, which is fantastic, to the book of Mark Lanegan's lyrics. I'm telling you, it's in the same exact category.
Yeah.
I firmly believe in time Mark Lanegan is going to be mentioned in the same breath as all of them.
Now, you did talk about the drugs being his downfall, but there's a chapter in the book, and this is a fascinating topic. You asked the question, did drugs help fuel or hinder his creativity? This is something you can ask of so many of these artists. And what kind of responses did you get regarding that question?
I got to tell you, I give a lot of the people I interviewed credit because you would, most people would be like, oh, no, it was, drugs will stifle your creativity and you never, you're so much better when you're off drugs. A few people said that. But then a few people, Chris Goss, who produced the album called Bubblegum, which is one of the best Mark albums I talked about earlier. He said that the session started, Mark was totally sober. He didn't have any lyrics for the album, though. Then Mark fell off the wagon. He got really bad into meth. And he just started spitting out lyrics like rapid fire. And they are probably some of the best lyrics Mark has ever done. So that shows that you never know how it is going to affect. Also, Gary Lee Conner from the Screaming Trees has a similar story. When the Screaming Trees were working on the Sweet Oblivion album, which is probably their best known and best selling album, it was a similar thing that they were all ready to go and they had all the songs written, all rehearsed, ready to go. They were going to go in the studio. Mark had no lyrics. Mark disappears for a few days. He probably fell off the wagon. They're all nervous, thinking like, all right, well, this album is going to be scrapped and we're going to be screwed. They all go in the studio. Mark shows up out of nowhere. He has all the lyrics done, and he says there's some of the best lyrics ever.
It sucks.
So
You
just
don't.
crazy.
You wish it didn't have to be that way, but that's the reality. That's what it is. I
That's
mean,
well, if you want to also back up to Blind Melon and also Soup, Shannon Hoon was really horrible with drugs during Soup. But those are some of my favorite lyrics. The whole needle fetal thing where he's talking about in 2x4. That's someone's pouring warm gravy all over me. That's probably the best description of, I mean, of course, I've personally never done heroin, but that to me is probably the best description of probably what doing heroin feels like.
look at the late '60s. How many of those songs would we have not gotten if those artists didn't do it? And it's not something that you don't encourage it. It just It is what it is. That's just what the reality was. We've talked about Van Halen a lot. The first album Eddie wrote sober, Van Halen 3, and it gets panned by critics, and that rocked him hard. So what does that do to somebody like that? Do I need to drink? Do I need to do drugs? It sucks. And that's not the case with all artists. I mean, there are artists who, once they get sober, they're razor sharp and they're focused. And
so what it was with Van Halen 3, Eddie was totally sober?
He says, it was the first album he ever wrote sober.
See, because what's so weird though, is you see interviews with him in that period and he seems like he's just off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if it was a mental thing with him or because like when I interviewed Wolfgang, he said that Eddie suffered from like a lot of, just like not being easy, being around people and stuff like, so I don't know if it was mental with him or what.
I remember Gary.
I mean, it's just it's very, very complicated. We'll obviously never know.
We'll never know. But I remember Gary Sharon, who sings on that album, for those who may not know, but he was saying that they asked if he was heavy into drugs and alcohol at that time. And his quote was something along the lines of, just paraphrasing, but he was just starting to get back into that.
Yeah, because I think he probably hit his low point when the reunion with Sammy, and then also when they got back with Roth at the beginning. I know he was really bad as well. Yeah.
So Screaming Trees were active from 1984 to 2000. What led to the end of the band?
Well, it kind of slowly ground to a halt. The tour for Dust, that was probably like a make or break album for them. If that album wasn't a big hit, I think they maybe they didn't, but to me, as an outsider looking in, that was really like their last shot, because like I was explaining before, at that point, grunge is not nearly as popular anymore. Now you have pop punk and rap metal and all this other garbage coming in.
Were they part of any package tours?
Well, I mean, in 1996, they were lucky to be on that Lollapalooza. That was the one that was headlined by Metallica and also had Soundgarden and also the Ramones on that bill, which is actually a good bill, but then again, that was Metallica at their lowest. That was when they were peddling that horrible Load album.
And I think that was the Ramones' last. That was the Ramones' last shows. I think
it was. Yeah, I think it was like one of their last big tours. Yeah, it was. But so what happened was, so that tour in support of that album stops. Mark gets really bad into drugs. But something I mentioned in the book, though, what's interesting, unlike Kurt Cobain and also Lane Staley, Mark was never as well off financially. So unlike Kurt and Lane that can fade from the public eye and come back and fade and come back, or in Lane's case, just eventually just fade and never come back, Mark had to keep working from time to time. So he's really bad, strung out on heroin, but yet he has to tour Europe with Screaming Trees. So now he's going through withdrawals on tour, and he feels like death, but he can't cancel the tour though. So he finds a way to soldier on. But eventually that, I think, creates a lot of friction in the band. Gary talks about that also. Van, his brother, also had a bit of a bad drug problem at the time. It's not just Mark. So what happens is after that album, that tour, they kind of go their separate ways, but they don't break up. They try to record. And also Josh Homme from later Queens of the Stone Age is the second guitarist in Screaming Trees at that point.
Really?
So they are planning on doing an album. They start recording and demoing, and they actually eventually released what they were working on. I think it was called Last Words, if I'm not mistaken. I forget the name of the album, but it came out a few years ago. But anyway, they tried to get things going. Mark's pretty much focusing on his solo material. Then the Screaming Trees get an opportunity to play a reunion in 2000 in Seattle. They played, and from the stage, similar to what David Bowie did with the whole Ziggy Stardust thing at Hammersmith Odeon, Mark Lanegan says from the stage, to the shock of everyone, that the Screaming Trees are over. And the band didn't know he was going to say that. He just said that himself on stage.
Now, he got better as a performer on stage, according to some of the quotes. Some people said that in the beginning he was a little shy, but he was just coming to his own.
Yeah, if you see, if you go on YouTube, you could see performances from the 80s, probably as late as 1989, where he's, well, I'll backtrack. Mark Lanegan's famous stage or his shtick was that he was not a wild performer. He would just stand there, hold on to the mic with one hand, the other hand hold the stand, and he would just stand there and sing. So you're forced to focus on his lyrics and forced to just, I guess, get off on the power of his vocals, which I could say from watching with Queens of the Stone Age actually did work. But if you see some of his performances from the 80s, he hasn't found that yet. So he is headbanging, and there's a few things where he's like more animated with like jumping around and everything. But I'd say it was 91-ish, 92 is when he finds his niche as a performer.
He had a solo career, as you mentioned. He worked with a lot of other artists, too. You devote a chapter to his many collaborations. What are some of your favorites that he was a part of?
Well, my favorite is probably Queens of the Stone Age. I think that was, I mean, for me.
How did that all come about? How did he team up?
Well,
with
him
those
and Josh were members together in Screaming Trees. They became friends. Okay. And then after Screaming Trees was kind of winding down, that's when Josh then forms Queens of the Stone Age. And I believe he wanted Mark involved in the first Queens of the Stone Age album, but Mark opted out for some reason. So on the second Queens of the Stone Age album, which is called Rated R, which came out in 2000, Mark sings a song, which is one of my favorite Mark songs. Again, fantastic lyrics. It's called In the Fade. And he has a great lyric. The best lyric on that is "Live till you die," which if you think about that, that's a pretty profound statement. And then from there, he starts touring with Queens of the Stone Age. And they did something very original, especially at the time, where they would play about almost half their set. And then Mark would come out and sing 3 or 4 songs, and they would just leave. They would do a bunch more songs. And usually for the encore, he'd come out and sing maybe like 1 or 2 songs. So he sang a total of only like 5 songs a night with them. But he would do entire tours with Queens of the Stone Age.
Who was their main singer?
Josh was,
yeah,
Josh
was
and also Nick, and also Nick Oliveri, the bass player who I interviewed for the book. And yeah, that was Queens of the Stone Age with that whole Songs for the Deaf lineup. That was, again, I'm sure I'm not the only fan that wishes that Nick and Josh stuck together longer, because after that album, Josh just became Queens of the Stone Age by himself, and Nick left the band.
Greg Prato's here. His brand new book, Lanegan. It's out now, so you can get it everywhere. Kindle, paperback, hardback, and if you prefer, go for a ride and have Greg Prato read the book to you. And Mark Lanegan was the author of several popular books. You talked about that. He wrote a few memoirs, also released books of poetry. What are some of the standout books? You did mention already a couple of his, 2 of his memoirs are worth
Yes, I would say Sing Backwards and Weep is definitely the best. But one thing that we learned in the book I did called Lanegan, quite a few people, and they are friends of his, it's not just fans, they question if everything he says in that book was actually true, or if he's just kind of embellishing on things, or if just his memory is playing tricks on him, because again, he was so bad off with drugs for a large chunk of his career. Yeah, because like one thing that Charles R. Cross says, who was the head editor of The Rocket, which was a very popular Seattle music paper at the time. And he also wrote I mentioned before, he wrote the Kurt Cobain biography called Heavier Than Heaven.
I have it.
Yes.
Great book.
He was talking about how in Mark's book, he was talking about how the Screaming Trees members really had nothing to do with the music. It was all him. And then Charles R. Cross says that's a big load of bullshit, that Gary Lee Conner, for the first few albums, wrote everything, including the lyrics. So why Mark would decide to lie about that? He doesn't understand why, he felt he had to pump himself up for his own self-worth. I don't know why he would say that, but we learned things like that certain things Mark may have definitely embellished a bit in his book.
But man, you talk about similarities with Jim Morrison vocally, but Jim Morrison was a poet too. There's a lot of similarities there. You ask a lot of these questions throughout the book, and one of them was, when was the last time you spoke to or saw Mark? Interesting, the varied responses. Do you say you were shocked at the news? Some thought it should have happened long ago. So we don't.
Yeah, definitely. Just from his lifestyle, he should have died in the 90s, just from being homeless, doing every kind of drug as much as you can. He talked, just a very unhealthy, dangerous lifestyle. And in his own book, he was homeless, horrible, degrading lifestyle that he was putting yourself in danger at every possible, point. He definitely talks about that a lot, that like drug dealers coming after him and him having to hide from the law. we talk about in my book called Lanegan, and also in his book. Surprisingly, you could say what you want about Courtney Love, but she came to Mark Lanegan's aid. She got him into rehab, pretty much saved his life, and also supposedly supported him for almost a whole entire year.
When was that?
That was in the late 90s. And he actually credits her with saving his life.
Wow.
Something that we learned in the book, which I'm not sure if you saw in the music news for the last week or so, there was a kind of a bombshell news piece from this book called Lanegan. Nick Oliveri from Queens of the Stone Age. Nick says that Mark told him that at one point when, I guess was when Nirvana was working on Nevermind, Kurt Cobain was working on the song called Something in the Way, and Mark Lanegan contributed some lyrics to that Kurt Cobain used. And when it came time for the credits or whatever, they agreed, both Kurt and Mark. Kurt was like, well, I appeared on your solo album, The Winding Sheet, so you contributed this. Why don't we just call it even? And they were like, all right, we'll just call it even. Of course, no one knew that Nevermind was going to go on to sell like 20 zillion albums.
Yes. So, oh man.
So,
and the song's done very well lately because it was in the Batman film.
Batman
film, it
exactly.
there, so that the sales and the streams of that song,
right,
he would have benefited from that.
But then Mark talks about in his book that I think Kurt may have felt guilty about that, because he talks about a story towards the end of Mark's life. Kurt just was going from ATM to ATM and taking out as much money as he possibly could, and just gave Mark several $1,000. This is when Mark was pretty much homeless. So he was doing kind of good deeds like that. And then also on top of that, I think Courtney Love probably saw how much Kurt admired Mark and really thought highly of him. And this is a good 5 or 6 years after Kurt died, she made it a point to help save Mark and put him in rehab, and pretty much put the clothes on his back. She bought him clothes and supposedly put him up for almost a whole entire year.
Wow. So now what lyrics, do we know what lyrics he contributes?
We don't know the lyrics.
No, we don't know. We don't know
the lyrics.
Wow.
That'll be that's sadly been lost over the sands of time.
Yeah. Let's finish. I want to ask about your interview with Mark Lanegan. You mentioned it, and you interviewed him December 15th, exactly, of 2021. What stands out to you?
Yeah, so
that was when it was published. Okay.
Yeah.
So what stands out to you about that interview, looking back on it now that he's gone? I mean, you did mention he sounded great.
Yeah, well, he sounded weak, but he was friendly and talkative.
Upbeat, right. He sounded weak, but he seemed to be looking forward to the future.
He was he admitted in the interview he was one of the type of people that was he was anti-vaccine and everything like that. But he said after his horrible bout with COVID, he said, I can't get the vaccine out fast enough. So he was talking about that. But something else we talk about in the book, several months earlier, he did an interview with Spin Magazine where he was very paranoid. He was talking about how he thought there were cameras behind his TV, and he got rid of all the TVs in his house and all this weird stuff. So people kind of think, well, maybe he was back on drugs, because it just didn't make sense. And then him and his wife just up and fled to Ireland. They just sold their house in LA and this is right in the middle of COVID too. They wanted to go to Portugal, but the only port of entry from America to Europe, I think, was Ireland at that time, or some country that you could only get into and then go to Ireland. So they wound up in Ireland. That's where Mark lived for the last year or so of his life. So it's like a lot of weird unanswered stuff. And I tried getting in contact with his widow. Her name is Shelley Bryan, and I never heard back from her. And even through mutual acquaintances, because some of the people I interviewed for the book are still in contact with her, and they either couldn't reach out or didn't want. I couldn't reach out, or she just wasn't ready to talk about it. So I sadly wasn't able to interview her for the book.
I mean, it could very well be the paranoia is actually when he's not on drugs. I mean, he could have had some kind of a mental illness that could have been addressed, maybe.
We never know.
Got to read your book, and then from there, listen to his body of work and read his books too. I mean, he was pretty well accomplished as an author. I mean, the guy, he was a talent. It's just sad that he didn't really fully. A lot of these guys, you wish they could just take a step back and say, damn, man, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, well, if you're either manic depressive or you're a drug addict, you can't put yourself in those people's shoes. It just makes no sense. if someone put a beer in front of me and said, if you can't drink this beer, else you'll become a full-fledged alcoholic, I personally would have no problem not drinking beer for the rest of my life. I can have a beer, every other day or socially. There's some people who just can't control themselves. I mean, it's with anything. It's with drinking, food, sex, gambling. There's just certain things for certain people can't handle it.
Well, his day has come thanks to this book. Now, I'm sure a lot more people are going to know about his work. So the book's out now, Lanegan, and we can get it through Amazon. Where else should people go to? Social media sites?
I would say pretty much Amazon is the best way to get it. And something else I wanted to say also about this book is also something else I wanted to set out is I wanted it to be a good companion piece to his book, because his book was just strictly him. It was no one else giving their 2 cents. And of course, as we all know, there's at least 2 sides to every story. So, for instance, he bashed Gary Lee Conner from the Screaming Trees in his book, which we find out he later actually was very, very sorry about. He made up with Gary Lee before he died, which I was happy to hear about.
Yeah.
But we get the other side, and it's Gary Lee Conner and also other people say, no, it's not. We don't understand why Mark bashed him so badly in that book, because Gary Lee Conner was a huge part of the Screaming Trees. So I think that this book definitely is a good companion. You definitely get the full picture of who Mark Lanegan was, I think, by reading his book, which is called Sing Backwards and Weep, and then followed up by reading my book, which is simply just titled Lanegan. And people can find you on social media. You're on Facebook, Twitter. Not really so much Facebook. Facebook not much. Is like my own. Yeah, Facebook is like my own private thing. But Twitter, I'm all about. If you want to get in contact with me, go to Twitter. I'm at twitter.com/Greg Prato Writer. And I'm also on Instagram, if you could believe that. But what's kind of funny with that is I post things about my books and things like that. But I like to do a shtick where I post pictures of me, but I don't show my face. Well, that's on Amazon, right? Your picture on Amazon? Yes, exactly. So if you go to Instagram, that's also Instagram.com/Greg Prato Writer. Like I'll post pictures of records I'm listening to or my latest books and stuff like that. But also I'll post like the other day I was at a beach and I took a video of a bird swimming in the water. Wonderful. All right. See, I gotta hook up with you through Instagram, because I'm on your Twitter. I follow you on Twitter, and you just posted something like literally a half hour before we started recording this, right? Last night I interviewed Marty Friedman, formerly of Megadeth. He just played with them for the first time in almost 20 to 23 years. He played with them in 2000, and just last night he played with 2 nights ago he played with them for the first time in 23 years over in Japan. I interviewed him for Heavy Consequence, and that article just went live today. Cool. Yeah, that's on my Twitter page. All right, Greg, thanks so much, man. This is, as always, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you. And again, go to Amazon, do a search for Greg Prato, and buy my books. You bet. All right, Greg. Thanks, Sark. I appreciate it.
That's it. It's in the books.